I read 6 books throughout April, and I think I may have read one of the best thrillers I've ever read. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about what the 6 books were. I'm going to let you know whether I thought they were any good or not. And then at the end, I might order them and show you them all at the same time. You know what booktubers do. But yeah, stay tuned for all of that. So we're going to start off with probably the worst book that I read throughout the month, which is Highrise by Vanessa Lee. I was very kindly sent this by a promoter, I think, of her book, and unfortunately it's just not that interesting. So Highrise covers the story of a woman and a man at the same time. I guess I can't remember the woman's name, but the guy's name is Mick. And essentially it's about the story of a town in Australia that gets affected by floods really, really badly. The general premise here is that global warming's bad. We know global warming's bad. I think the biggest problem with this book is it doesn't tell us anything new. The plot's not particularly interesting. Nothing really happens. This kind of interconnection between a male and a female throughout that you're a little bit confused as to whether it's supposed to be going anywhere or not, whether you're interested or care that it does or not. And then all of a sudden at the end they're like, oh yeah, by the way, there's this big like weather warning happening, and therefore everybody needs to get out of town and we need to start saving people. And it's about the Tinny Army, who are a group of people, kind of like local group of people that get together and talk about how bad climate change is and how they need to change things. And these Tinny Army, or this Tinny Army, then ends up going out and saving the people that are worse affected by the storm, I guess. However, it's just not that great, unfortunately. I wasn't blown away by it. I thought it was really underwhelming. As I said, the characters weren't particularly interesting. The plot itself was very underwhelming and nothing really happened until the very end, and even then that kind of petered out. It was like, oh, things are getting really exciting. It's like, and then that's the end of the book, and you're like, oh. There is one little thing at the end that happens that surprised me that I thought was quite brave from the author. I thought everything had been really safe up until then, and that was not safe. Interesting. I guess that was to kind of amplify the importance of the book and how it's all about global warming and how global warming can have a big effect on people. Not trying to spoil the plot, but yeah, not my favorite book of the month, but I recommend if you do you're interested in global warming or that's something you want to be reading about, Highrise by Vanessa Lee would cover and kind of itch that scratch if you have scratch that itch, even if you have an itch about global warming. But yeah, that's Highrise by Vanessa Lee. I have no idea if this next book is the next book I read throughout April. I'm just now doing them in a random order. It is In Memorium by Alice Wynne. This was brilliant, really, really brilliant. It is my book pick of the month. So as I said at the start, I say in every video, at the start of the year even, I asked you all to pick one book that I should read throughout 2024. I picked the 12 most popular and then assigned each of those books to a month based on when pre-orders came out or whether I had them or not, or when they'd come out on Libby, these sort of things. In Memorium was April's, and it was brilliant. It is heartbreaking. It's essentially about 2 boys that then turn into men who are at school together. They go to a public school together. They're very posh. Their parents are quite posh. And then the World War I comes around, and one of them enlists, then the other enlists, and it's their story of what happens during the war and a little bit about what happens after the war. They are essentially falling in love with each other, but during a time when 2 men really socially can't fall in love with each other, it's seen as kind of dirty, wrong against the Bible, these sort of obscene views that people had like 100 years ago. So they're quite shy about announcing it. One of them's particularly macho, therefore I think he thinks it will be even worse for him because it's kind of, no, I'm this macho bully, I can't be seen to be loving another man, this sort of thing. Essentially it covers their story. It's fantastic. The 2 characters themselves are brilliant. There's a character arc that happens. One of them changes as a result of the war, which is really, really powerful, like believable and impressive. That was probably my favorite thing about the whole book. The plot itself's not mind-blowing. There are some big moments, and it does cover the idea of war well. The idea being that in World War I, absolutely nobody was safe. You could easily be taken, you could easily be killed, everybody was killed, people were killed very quickly, you get to know somebody, you get to like somebody, and then bam, they were gone from your lives. And that's generally what happens in Memoriam, and that's the kind of message here. Really, really powerful. A lot of people said it made them cry. I can maybe see why. I think it's very sad, it's very heart-wrenching. It's constantly saying, yes, that person you just got attached to about 2 pages ago, they died from a bomb. So that happens a lot, so if that affects your heart. If you're somebody who has struggled as somebody who is gay and struggled coming out, so not felt comfortable doing so, you may also find some elements of this book that are difficult to read or even resonate with you and therefore make you feel happy that these two people do end up together. That's a massive plot twist. Plot spoiler, sorry, I'm so sorry. But I think you would guess that from the start. But either way, really, really, really good book. Absolutely made up for the Highrise being bang average. And again, 4 books out of 4 now that you guys have recommended that have been absolutely fantastic. The next book I want to talk about is Waywood by Amelia Hart. This was, I don't know, the 3rd book I read in the month. May not have been, I may have read another one before it, but I'm going to put it 3rd. Waywood is about 3 stories. It covers 3 women throughout 3 different periods in time. There's a modern day story, there's one set in the 1942, and a little bit later, and there's one set back in 1619. It covers 3 completely different stories as well. They're not kind of related in their theme. They are related in that I think the women are connected. There's definitely a connection between the woman from 1942 and the present day woman. They are literally relatives. However, the woman back in 1619 is far back, and I think they are related. I think there are stories about them in each other's stories, as it were. But my biggest problem with this is that if you're going to write 3 different stories in one book, you've got to make each of those 3 different stories, 1, either long enough to fill out a whole story arc, or 2, interesting enough within those short amount of pages that you are compelled by them and that you're actually interested in them. And unfortunately, Waywood just doesn't do that for me. The stories themselves were fine, they were fairly gripping, but not memorable. In fact, I couldn't tell you anything that interesting that happened in the one in 1619. I think she was essentially accused of being a witch, and that's it. Nothing else really happened. The one in 1942, she has a horrible incident happen to her when she's young. That affects her life, but once the horrible incident happens, again, nothing else then really ever happens. And in the present day story, it's about a woman fleeing from her abusive and controlling boyfriend, and again, once a certain element happens, you think, well, that's it. That was all that happened. Nothing else has happened since. So, underwhelming story, unfortunately. Really nice front cover. I like the premise. I love historical fiction. I love the idea of covering 3 different storylines, and there is a link between them, so that's nice as well. But other than that, I think it's fine. It's not great. I think if I gave it a review, I'd give it a 3.75 or a 4. I think I've already reviewed it on my blog. I can't remember what I gave it, but go check that out. I'll pop a link here. But yeah, that's Waywood by Amelia Hart. It was fine. Then on to books that were much better than fine, and this was The Drift by CJ Tudor. Now, I'd heard a lot about CJ Tudor. The reason I picked up The Drift is because a while back I did a video on my TikTok. I may have done it on here as well. I think I did. It's the video about where I said 6 books in 4 hours or something. I picked up CJ Tudor for about £1.50 from a charity shop and put it in a pile on a post, and this was the one that everybody says that's the one you need to start reading. CJ Tudor is fantastic. The Drift is, again, very similar to Waywood actually. It covers 3 different stories, except these are all set, what you believe to be, at the same time. They're all set definitely in the same place anyway. It's The Drift because essentially they're set in a snowy area and they're all affected by the weather. The first story is about a group of a coach of overturned students. They're trapped, they're struggling, they can't get out of the coach. The other one is about a group of people, strangers, that are stuck in a cable car together. They don't know why they're in a cable car together. And then the last one is about a retreat, which is what you find out is the whole book is about, really. It's about this retreat. So then the element of where I got really interested in the book is when they start talking about the fact that this is actually set in kind of like a world where a virus has affected humanity. Think COVID, but it killed a lot more people and left a lot of people as creatures, they call them, or people still, but they're called whistlers. So I think it's kind of like a zombie character. So the reason they're whistlers is it affects your lungs, similar to how COVID did, but in a lot more extreme way, to a point where it gave them mania, so they're crazy and chaotic and violent, and also they whistle when they breathe, so that's why they're called whistlers, so you can kind of hear them coming. So there's that fancy element in there, which I was really interested by. And on the back here it says Britain's female Stephen King, and I was like, why? And then that's clicked, because Stephen King likes to write these kind of human stories that are kind of normal, but with a little bit of kind of like paranormal fantasy elements to them, and that's what The Drift does. Whereas the Waywood, I wasn't that bothered about any of the characters, I wasn't that bothered about the stories did nothing for me. Each of these stories was brilliant. I felt like I was reading 3 different books in one book. Now, I don't know if there's actually more words in here or there's more just better plot going on, but I could tell you each of these 3 different stories and what's going in them. I could tell you each of the different characters. I could identify them. Obviously, nearly all books I listen to on audiobook. And yes, sometimes you do actually get different narrators. Nearly all the time you get different narrators if different characters are involved. But that still doesn't help me identify who's who, because if a male's reading and then another slightly different male's reading, I don't know if that's Charlie or Joe. But as soon as you're a good enough writer to be able to identify that Charlie has a very identifiable personality and that Joe has a very different personality, and you can allow the reader to know who they're reading about, or in my case, listening about. Say I zone out of the audiobook and zone back in 5 minutes later, just after a few words or a few scenes or something like that, I can tell I'm reading about Charlie because he's brave or something like that. They're not actual characters in this book, I'm using an example there. The Drift does this well, that's what I'm trying to explain. The Drift does this really well. Great mini plots, really identifiable characters. Wasn't mind blown. There is an overarching plot that's quite clever, I quite enjoyed. I think it would make a fantastic film. There is actually a clever twist in it where you find out, and I don't know if this is a plot twist because, but that their stories are actually connected in terms of someone from one knows somebody from the other, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, really, really impressed by that. That's my first CJ Tudor, which I always struggle to say. I believe I've got to read The Gathering next because a lot of people rave about The Gathering as well. So that's The Drift by CJ Tudor. Loved this. So then the next two books are actually going to be in a completely different video that I'm doing as well. So I asked a couple of authors or a few authors on Instagram what their favourite book was. Two big authors responded to me in Claire Douglas and Lisa Jewell. They suggested to me, he goes off camera, comes back on camera, None of This Is True, ironically by Lisa Jewell, so that was Claire Douglas recommending that, wasn't Lisa Jewell recommending her own book. And Lie With Me by Sabine Durrant was Lisa Jewell's recommendation. So I read these, we'll talk about Lie With Me first. So Lie With Me by Sabine Durrant is a really, really interesting book. At the start, or for most of it, you think it's a really bad book. Our main character, Paul, is utterly detestable. He's chauvinistic, he's opinionated, he's got very kind of old age views on women and on society and things like this. He's our main character. He's the one we read everything from the point of view of, so we know what he thinks. He's also not very nice to the people involved. There's also not a lot of story going on. It's essentially about Paul meets an old friend from school. He then meets this woman at a party that he goes to with this man, or a house gathering, it's not a party. They end up getting in a relationship. She then invites them on a holiday with the old friend and a group of friends on this kind of family holiday. Back to a place where Paul has seen them before. So it's the same town in which he drunkenly kind of met them before. As I said, for 70-80% of the book, you don't really know what's going on. You don't really care what's going on. It seems very dull. Then the ending ravels everything up. Can you ravel something up? He ravels everything up in such a fantastic way that it makes you understand why Sabine Durrant wrote Paul like he is. It makes you understand why these odd little things kept happening. You're like, well, that's just random and weird. Why did that happen? And it rounds it up really, really well at the end. And it made reading the whole 70-80% of the book that I didn't like feel like I really, really liked it. And that's a really, really interesting idea for me, because usually if you get into a book and you don't like it and you get to the end, that's because the whole book is bad. But there's an element now where I think Sabine has definitely written him to be detestable. She's written the story to not be fast-paced, to not be throwing stuff at you all the time, but instead to have these kind of small little elements that make you think, and at the end it gives you all the answers to all these things. Really, really impressed by this, actually. Nearly all my videos at the start that I kind of put on social were like, I don't get it. All my posts on Twitter were like, I don't get it. And Lisa was like, well, maybe stick it out. I'm glad I stuck it out. Really, really worth it. Genuinely impressed. One of the most interesting thrillers in terms of how it's kind of put together that I've read in a long time. So Lisa Jewell's favourite thriller of all time is really good, actually. And then staying on a theme of Lisa Jewell, but Claire Douglas's recommendation was None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This might be the best thriller I've ever read. I really am trying to temper how excited I got about this book as I was reading it, because I don't want people to think this is the best book I've ever read. I think some people may not have thought this is the best thriller they've ever read, but something about this book I was so impressed by. So I listened to the audiobook as well as reading the physical book. I would definitely recommend listening to the audiobook if you can, because within this book there's a podcast and a Netflix series that are kind of intertwined into it based on the story you're reading. So it's kind of, I'll explain more in a second. And in the audiobook they use different narration, different voices, and even little bits of music to kind of make those feel a little bit more realistic. So None of This Is True focuses on Josie Fares and Alex Summers. Josie Fares one night is in a pub celebrating her 45th birthday with her husband for kind of like a quiet meal out. Alex Summers comes bundling in with some friends, and also celebrating her birthday. Josie goes into the toilet with her and says, oh, we're the birthday twins. She then starts looking Alex up and realizes that Alex has a really successful podcast. Josie then weirdly says, I would love to do a podcast with you about my life. I'm about to change everything in my life. My life's a lot darker and weirder than it seems. She's got a husband who's a lot older than her and probably too old, and there's a lot going on here that I can't explain because it's the reason that I love this book. The plot, the twists, the constant reveal that Josie does, and then or Alex finds out, or a newspaper clipping kind of reads about it. It's so good. Josie goes from being a fairly normal person to utterly different. Again, I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's so gripping. Really, I think, yeah, one of the best thrillers I've ever read. As I said, Alex does this podcast with Josie and reveals more and more about Josie's kind of past, her present, and the kind of where she's going with her life. Gets too involved with Josie. Things end up getting more impactful than she'd intended. Listen to how I'm trying to use words that don't actually give away plot, but give you an idea of what's going on here. None of this is true, maybe one of the best thrillers I've ever read. I know Lisa Jewell is famous for some great thrillers. I've read some of hers in the past. I've read The Family Upstairs, the sequel to The Family Upstairs. I read Then She Was Gone. I'm not sure if I've read any of her others, but this is, to me, the best thriller that Lisa Jewell has ever done. So impressive. In fact, I went and listened. You can listen to the podcast segments of the audiobook as a separate podcast over on like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I really want it to be a Netflix series. This is one of those books where you think if that was in one of those Netflix documentaries where people were like texting their mates like, can you believe this even ever happened? That's exactly what this book is. That's how gripping it was. It's like watching those and having to text your friends about it. That's the same feeling I got when I finished reading this book. So that's None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. My favourite book of the month, by far. Utterly brilliant. So there we have it. Here's all the books that I read throughout the month. We've got Vanessa Lee's The Highrise, which I thought was an average, very average. In Memorium by Alice Wynne. Waywood by Amelia Hart. The Drift by CJ Tudor. Lie With Me by Sabine Durrant, and then None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. So if I had to order these in my least favourite to most favourite throughout the month, it'd have to go probably Highrise by Vanessa Lee is my least favourite, then probably Waywood, then I would have to say The Drift, then Lie With Me, then In Memoriam, then None of This Is True, with None of This Is True being my favourite book of the month. Utterly fantastic. Let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, what you read throughout April. I may have said March throughout this video. I'm very confused what month we're in. What books did you read in April? Let me know down below. But as always, don't forget to like and subscribe because that's the best thing you can do for a YouTuber. But until the next video, I'll see you later. Goodbye.